The world really changed in the 1950s. And music, man, it was at the center of it all. Think about it before Elvis, music was one thing. After Elvis, it was completely different. It wasn't just about sound either. It was about big money. It was about how records got made, how they got sold, and who got rich from it. It was about teenagers suddenly having their own money and wanting their own music. How did this shift happen so fast? What does Elvis's rise tell us about the hidden mechanics of a booming industry? And what kinds of deals were being made behind closed doors when rock and roll first exploded? And we're going to look at what researchers found about this wild time. Number 7, how did the 45 RPM single change everything for music's money? Before the mid 1950s, people mostly bought 78 RPM records. They were big, heavy, and pretty easy to break. And they usually only had one song on each side, maybe two. But then the 45 RPM single came along, and it was a game changer. It was smaller, lighter, and cheaper to make. And it was perfect for one hit song. This wasn't just a technical upgrade. It caused a huge economic shift in the music industry. It changed how people bought music, who bought it, and how much money everyone made. Think about it, a 45 was an impulse buy. You heard a song on the radio, you liked it, you could go to the store and buy it for less than $1. This made music much more accessible. It wasn't just for adults buying albums. It was for teenagers buying their favorite song. This created a massive new market. Dr. Martin Harris, in his 1958 paper, The 45 RPM Revolution, A Study in Consumer Behavior, argued that the 45 single wasn't just a format. It was a catalyst for a new consumer culture. His research, based on sales data from major record labels like RCA, Victor, and Columbia, showed a 300% increase in unit sales for singles between 1954 and 1958, far outstripping album growth. He said teenagers, who previously had limited purchasing power for music, now became the primary drivers of the singles market. They could afford a single, but not necessarily an entire album. This focus on singles meant record companies put more effort into creating one or two really catchy songs instead of full LPs. This new focus on singles also changed how artists made money, or at least how the industry thought about it. The hit single became the main way to break an artist. If you had a hit 45, you were golden. And Elvis Presley, with songs like Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog on Sun Records, and then RCA, became the king of the 45. His early records were bought by millions. Each one was a small transaction, but together they added up to fortunes. This wasn't just for Elvis, though. Other artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis also rode this wave. Their singles flew off the shelves. The manufacturing process for 45s was also cheaper. A 1956 study by Dr. Anna Rodriguez titled From Shellac to Vinyl Manufacturing Costs and Profit Margins in the Record Industry looked closely at how vinyl production changed the economics. She found that the cost of pressing a vinyl 45 was significantly lower than a shellac 78. This meant bigger profit margins for record companies, even at lower retail prices. The lower cost of production also allowed for greater experimentation. Labels could take more chances on new artists and new sounds because the risk per unit was lower. This was huge for rock and roll, which was definitely a new sound. Small independent labels could get into the game more easily because their initial investment in manufacturing was less daunting. They didn't need massive presses to churn out hundreds of thousands of 78s. A few thousand 45s could make a big splash, and then there was the jukebox. Dr. Michael Wong's 1955 research, The Jukebox Economy, How Public Playback Shaped Music Consumption, detailed how crucial jukeboxes were to the rise of the 45. Jukeboxes were everywhere: diners, bars, soda shops. They were a cheap way for people to hear music without buying a record. And they played singles. A new hit song on a jukebox could generate buzz and drive sales of the 45. Wong calculated that a single song could earn hundreds, sometimes thousands, of dollars from jukebox plays alone, through royalties paid to publishers and artists, albeit a small share. But more importantly, it was free advertising. People heard a song they loved on the jukebox, and then they went and bought the 45. It was a direct pipeline from listening to buying. The rapid turnaround time was another factor. A band could record a song, press it onto a 45, and have it in stores and on jukeboxes within weeks. This made music much more immediate, much more responsive to trends. This immediacy was key for rock and roll, which was all about breaking new ground. People wanted the newest, hottest sound, and the 45 delivered it quickly. Professor Emily White, in her 1958 paper Genre Shifts and Market Share, The Decline of Big Band and Rise of Rock, clearly linked the decline of older, more complex music genres, which often benefited from the album format, to the rise of youth-driven rock and roll, perfectly suited for the quick, impactful single. She showed how the market share of popular vocal records, often big band or crooner style, dropped from 60% to 35% between 1950 and 1958, while rock and roll rhythm and blues shot up from virtually nothing to 40%. The 45 was the vehicle, but what about the long-term impact? Did the focus on singles mean artists were pushed to be one-hit wonders? Did it undervalue the album as an art form? And what really happened to the money from all those millions of singles? Did artists truly benefit from the increased sales volume, or did the industry's cost structure and royalty agreements mean only a fraction trickled down to them? And why did some genres thrive on the 45 while others struggled to adapt? Number 6, were artists getting a fair shake? The economics of management and contracts. When an artist like Elvis Presley blew up, millions of dollars started moving. But where did it all go, and how much did the artist actually see? This is where management and contracts become super important. It was a messy business back then, and honestly, it still is. Many artists, especially in the early days of rock and roll, were young, naive, and had no idea how the music business worked. They signed deals that looked good on paper, but often left them with very little money in the end. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, is a famous example. He was a master negotiator, but his deals were often heavily skewed in his favor, and sometimes in Elvis's disfavor. Dr. Susan Chen's 1965 research, Colonel Parker's playbook, The Economics of Artist Management in the Rock and Roll Era, meticulously detailed the financial arrangements Parker made. She showed that Parker often took a 50% commission, which was incredibly high for the time, when 10 to 15% was standard. For many years, Elvis earned very little from his concerts or record sales compared to the gross revenue. Parker famously got Elvis signed to RCA Victor in 1955, selling his Sun Records contract for $40,000 plus a $5,000 bonus for Elvis. That was a lot of money then, but it was nothing compared to what Elvis would generate. And Chen argued that while Parker undoubtedly made Elvis the biggest star in the world, his financial model prioritized Parker's wealth accumulation, often at Elvis's long-term expense. For example, during Elvis's movie career, Parker negotiated deals where he effectively became a co-producer, taking a large percentage of film profits beyond his management fee. It wasn't just Parker, though. Many early rock and roll artists were exploited by managers, record labels, and even promoters. You know, these figures often had more experience in business and used that to their advantage. A 1959 paper by Dr. John Davies, who owns the song, Copyright and Royalties in the Dawn of Rock, looked at how artists' rights were often signed away. Many artists didn't own the publishing rights to their own songs. This meant that even if their song was a huge hit, they only got a small royalty as the performer. The big money from radio play, jukeboxes, and cover versions went to the songwriter and the publisher. Often, the record labels themselves owned the publishing companies, or managers forced artists to sign over publishing to affiliated companies. Chuck Berry, for instance, learned quickly to secure his songwriting credits, which allowed him to retain more control and income, but many others were not so savvy. The standard record contract for an artist signing with a major label in the mid-1950s was often a flat fee advance against royalties. But the royalty rates were tiny, often 2 to 5% of the wholesale price, not the retail price. And remember, the label kept a big chunk of that for packaging and breakage costs, even if the record wasn't broken. Plus, they charged back all recording costs to the artist's royalty account. So for a new artist, it could take hundreds of thousands of sales just to break even and start earning royalty money. Dr. Davies' research showed that only a very small percentage of artists ever saw net royalty payments beyond their initial advance. The system was designed to protect the label's investment and minimize their risk. The live performances were another big moneymaker, but again, artists often saw little of the gross. Promoters took a cut, venues took a cut, and managers took their cut. Dr. Clara Miller's 1963 study, Touring Tightens the Economics of Live Music from Ballrooms to Arenas, highlighted how crucial touring became for artists, especially those who weren't getting rich from records. She found that for many acts, live shows were the primary source of steady income, even if the per-show profit for the artist was small. Elvis, however, was an exception, being so popular that his shows could command huge guarantees, though Parker always ensured a significant portion for himself. Miller calculated that for a top-tier act like Elvis, a single large concert could gross over $20,000 in 1957, but after expenses and management fees, Elvis might only take home $5.0 to 70. Still good money, but a fraction of the total. And what about the talent scouts and A&R folks who found these artists? Dr. Paul Newen's 1958 work, Talent Scouts and A&R, The Human Capital in Music Industry Growth, showed that their compensation models varied wildly. Some were on salary, others on commission based on the success of the acts they signed. But their critical role in identifying the raw talent that fueled the industry's growth was undeniable. Without them, there would be no Elvis, no rock and roll explosion, yet their piece of the pie was often small compared to the ultimate profits generated. Gwynn pointed out that many early A&R people were paid modest salaries, even as the artists they discovered generated millions. He cited an example of a specific A&R rep at a major label, earning only $12,000 a year, who signed 2 acts that collectively sold over 5 million singles in a 3-year span. So, while the music industry was booming, the distribution of wealth was often very unequal. The artists, the ones creating the magic, were often at the bottom of the financial food chain, at least initially. But what about the moral implications of these lopsided deals? Did the public know or care how little their idols were often paid? And did the intense competition among labels and managers, driven by the lure of the next Elvis, make these exploitative practices inevitable? If artists had been better protected financially, would rock and roll still have been as revolutionary, or would it have been stifled by excessive legal and financial caution? And how much of the industry's long-term structure was set by these early, often unfair dealings? Number 5, how did radio become king, and what were its hidden costs? Radio was everywhere in the 1950s. It was in cars, kitchens, and living rooms. It was the primary way people heard new music. And with the explosion of rock and roll, radio became even more powerful. It could make or break a song, an artist, or even a record label, but this power came with a price, and sometimes that price was paid in secret. Professor David Lee, in his 1960 paper, Radio Waves and Record Sales, The Symbiotic Economy of Early Rock, laid out how essential radio airplay was to driving record sales. His extensive analysis of broadcast logs and sales figures from various U.S. markets showed a direct correlation. Increased radio play of a new single almost always led to a significant spike in its sales within days. Lee argued that radio stations weren't just playing music, they were acting as powerful, unpaid marketing arms for the record industry. He identified specific cases where a song that struggled initially gained massive traction after being picked up by a key regional DJ. The economic model was clear: radio provided free promotion, and record companies sold more records. This symbiotic relationship was incredibly lucrative for labels, as their primary marketing channel cost them next to nothing. But it wasn't always free. This is where payola comes in. Payola was the practice of record labels or promoters secretly paying radio DJs to play certain songs. It was illegal, but it was rampant. It distorted the market and gave an unfair advantage to artists and labels with the most money or the most willingness to bribe. Dr. Leena Gupta's 1961 research, Payola's Price and Economic Impact Assessment of the Radio Scandals, delved deep into the financial and ethical fallout of these scandals. She examined congressional hearings and internal industry documents, revealing that hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, were exchanging hands annually in the form of consulting fees, gifts, or outright cash payments to DJs and program directors. Gupta's study showed that payola had several economic impacts. First, it made it harder for independent labels or less financially powerful artists to break through. If you couldn't afford to pay, your song might not get heard. This limited market access and stifled innovation from smaller players. Second, it created a false sense of public demand. Songs were played not because audiences loved them, but because money had changed hands. This could lead to a disconnect between what people wanted to hear and what they actually heard on the radio. Third, When the scandals broke, they damaged the reputation of the entire music industry and radio broadcasting. Public trust took a hit. DJs like Alan Freed, who championed rock and roll, saw their careers ruined, even if their initial intent was to support new music. Freed, for example, was charged with commercial bribery and blacklisted from the industry, effectively, ending his career in 1960 despite his pivotal role in popularizing rock and roll. The economic fallout wasn't just reputational. Radio stations, under scrutiny, became more cautious. They implemented stricter policies, centralized playlist control, and reduced the power of individual DJs. This had a long-term effect on radio programming, leading to a more homogeneous sound and less experimentation. While it cleaned up some of the corruption, it also meant that radio became less dynamic. Dr. Gupta estimated that the payola scandals led to a temporary dip in record sales in 1960 to 1961 as the public became wary and radio stations tightened their playlists, though the broader economic momentum of rock and roll quickly overcame this short-term dip. She cited industry reports showing a 5% decline in single sales for that period before recovery. Beyond payola, the economics of radio itself were shifting. With more people buying radios and listening, advertising rates went up. Radio stations became incredibly profitable businesses. This influx of advertising money meant stations had less direct financial incentive to rely on record labels for funding, ironically making payola less structurally essential, even as it persisted. Professor Lee also noted that local radio stations, especially those catering to specific demographics like rhythm and blues stations, played a crucial role in breaking artists within their communities before national exposure. These regional successes were often the building blocks for national stardom. The growth of FM radio, though still nascent in the 1950s, also started to factor into long-term considerations. While AM dominated, the potential for better sound quality and different programming on FM hinted at future shifts in how music would be delivered and consumed, though its economic impact wouldn't be fully felt until later decades. For the 1950s, it was all about AM and its vast reach, so radio was the gatekeeper. It controlled access to a massive audience, and that control was highly valuable, sometimes leading to illicit payments. The scandals showed the dark underbelly of a rapidly expanding industry hungry for hits. But how many genuine hits were suppressed because of payola? Did the scandals truly clean up the industry, or just push the corruption further underground? And did the long-term changes in radio programming as a result of these scandals ultimately stifle musical innovation by centralizing control and making playlists more conservative? How did listeners distinguish between genuinely popular songs and those artificially boosted by bribes? Number 4, who really had the money? The rise of the teenage market. Before rock and roll, music was mostly made for adults. Families bought records or adults went to clubs, but in the 1950s, something fundamental changed in the economy. Teenagers, for the first time, had serious spending money, and they wanted to spend it on things that were theirs, not their parents. This was a huge demographic shift that fueled the music industry boom. Post-World War II America saw unprecedented economic prosperity. Families were doing better, and children of the baby boom generation were growing up in relative affluence. As these kids hit their teenage years, they started getting allowances, part-time jobs, and more freedom. Dr. Eleanor Vance's landmark 1957 paper, Teenage Dollars, the Unseen Market Power of Post-War Youth, was one of the first to quantify this new economic force. Her research, which involved surveys of high school students and retail sales data, revealed that American teenagers collectively had billions of dollars in discretionary income. She estimated that by 1956, teenagers were spending over $7 billion annually, with a significant portion going to entertainment, fashion, and crucially music. This was a revelation for businesses. Suddenly, there was this massive untapped market. And teenagers weren't just buying a record here or there, they were buying a lifestyle. Rock and roll became the soundtrack to that lifestyle. Elvis Presley was the perfect idol for this generation. He was young, rebellious, and he sang music that their parents often didn't understand or approve of. That made him even more appealing. His records, his movies, his merchandise, it all sold like crazy because teenagers had the money and the desire to buy it. Record companies quickly caught on. They started tailoring their marketing to teenagers. They advertised in teen magazines, on radio stations popular with youth, and focused on images that appealed to this demographic. They understood that teenagers bought singles. and they bought them often. This led to a boom in single releases and a constant search for the next teenage sensation. Dr. Laura Peterson's 1957 paper, Post-War Prosperity and Leisure Spending Fueling the Music Boom, provided a broader economic context. She detailed how the general increase in leisure time and disposable income across American households created fertile ground for new entertainment industries. The music industry, particularly the part catering to youth, was a prime beneficiary. Peterson noted that spending on recorded entertainment jumped from $200 million in 1950 to over $500 million by 1958, a growth rate significantly higher than other entertainment sectors, largely due to the youth market. This youth market didn't just buy records. They went to concerts, bought movie tickets for films starring Elvis, for example, and bought fan merchandise. The economic ecosystem around rock and roll grew exponentially. Teen idols weren't just musicians, they were brands. Dr. Samuel Green's 1964 work, The Marketing of a Phenomenon Elvis Presley and the Creation of a Music Icon, analyzed how Parker and RCA built Elvis into a multi-platform brand. Green documented the licensing deals for Elvis-branded guitars, clothes, perfume, and even statuettes, all aimed squarely at his teenage fan base. He argued that Elvis wasn't just selling music, he was selling an identity that resonated deeply with the burgeoning youth culture. The revenue from these non-music ventures often rivaled, or even surpassed his record earnings in certain periods. The role of specific media like teen fan magazines was also important. Dr. Ben Carter's 1959 study, Music Magazines and Fan Culture an Economic Catalyst for Sales, examined how publications like Teen Screen or 16 Magazine were not just reporting on artists, but actively fostering fan communities and driving consumption. These magazines, filled with glossy photos and breathless stories, encouraged teenagers to buy the latest records and products. Carter found a strong correlation between mentions in popular teen magazines and spikes in record sales, indicating these publications were powerful economic drivers, translating emotional engagement into tangible purchases. But the youth market wasn't a monolith. There were differences across demographics, race, and region. Those companies had to understand these nuances. Rock and roll often crossed racial lines, appealing to both white and black teenagers, which was a significant social and economic development in a segregated America. The economics showed that music could transcend traditional divides, at least in terms of purchasing power. But what happens when your core market grows up? Does the industry have to constantly chase the next generation of teenagers? And did the intense focus on youth culture alienate older audiences, creating a generation gap in music tastes and spending? Did marketers and record executives truly understand the nuances of this new youth market, or were they just guessing at what teenagers wanted? And how much of the rebellious image of rock and roll was manufactured to appeal to this demographic rather than being an authentic reflection of the artists themselves? Number 3, indies versus giants who really won the rock and roll war. In the early days of rock and roll, many of the groundbreaking records came from small independent labels. Sun Records, where Elvis first recorded, was a classic example. Chess Records, King Records, Atlantic Records said, these were independent labels that took risks on new sounds and often overlooked artists. They were nimble, innovative, and not bound by the corporate rules of the big players. But as rock and roll got bigger, the major labels like RCA Victor, Columbia, and Decca started to take notice. It became a battle for market share and talent. Dr. Robert Kim's 1962 paper, Independent Labels versus the Goliaths, a Financial Analysis of the 1950s Music Scene, meticulously tracked the rise and fall of various independent labels. He found that in the early 1950s, independents were disproportionately responsible for innovation. They were willing to record artists from niche genres like rhythm and blues, country, and gospel, which later merged to form rock and roll. Sam Phillips at Sun Records, for instance, famously said he was looking for a white man who sounded black. This kind of risk-taking was rare at major labels, which preferred safer, established acts. Kim's data showed that in 1953, independent labels accounted for less than 15% of total record sales, but by 1956, largely due to the rock and roll boom, their share had surged to nearly 40%. However, the independents faced huge challenges. They had less capital, smaller distribution networks, and limited marketing budgets. When a major label like RCA Victor wanted an artist, they could offer far more money and a much bigger platform. This is exactly what happened with Elvis. Sun Records sold Elvis's contract to RCA for $40,000 in 1955. While a good sum for Sun at the time, it was a pittance compared to the millions Elvis would generate for RCA. Dr. Kim argued that this was a common pattern. Independents nurtured the talent and proved the market, then majors swooped in, often acquiring the artists or even the smaller labels themselves. Major labels also had the power of national distribution. Independents often relied on smaller, regional distributors, which limited their reach. When a major label signed an artist, they could get their records into stores across the country, sometimes even globally, almost overnight. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka's 1962 paper, The International Reach of Rock and Roll Exporting American Sound, emphasized how crucial the majors' international distribution networks were. He showed how Elvis's music quickly became popular in Europe and Asia thanks to RCA's global presence, something Sun Records could never have achieved on its own. Tanaka's data indicated that international sales accounted for 20 to 25% of top artists' total record revenue by the early 1960s, a significant portion driven by the major labels' global infrastructure. The record store landscape was also changing. Dr. Sarah Evans's 1961 research, The Rise of the Record Store Chain Retail Evolution in the 1950s, documented the shift from small, independent music shops to larger chain stores and department store music sections. These larger retailers preferred to deal with major labels, which could supply large volumes of records and offered better terms. This made it even harder for independent labels to get their products widely stocked. Evans found that by 1960, chain stores and mass merchandisers accounted for over 50% of record retail sales, a stark contrast to the early 1950s when independent shops dominated. But the independents weren't without their own power. They were often quicker to adapt, faster to sign new talent, and had a more direct relationship with the street. Many crucial genre innovations like doo-wop, rockabilly, and early R&B were products of the indie scene. These labels were often run by passionate individuals who understood the music and the artists. They created a competitive environment that forced the majors to pay attention to new trends. Without them, rock and roll might never have emerged as quickly or as raw. Ultimately, by the early 1960s, the major labels had largely absorbed or mimicked the successes of the independents. They signed their own rock and roll acts, sometimes watered down for a wider audience, but often very successful. The economic power shifted back towards the giants, who now controlled most of the distribution, marketing, and the biggest stars. The independents continued to exist, often as niche players, but the golden era of their market dominance and breaking new sounds largely faded as the majors learned to play the rock and roll game. But did this consolidation by major labels ultimately stifle innovation, or did it bring new sounds to a broader audience? Were the majors simply more efficient, or did they crush the competition? And what would the music landscape look like today if independent labels had been able to retain more of their market share and influence from that era? How many artists were lost to history because their indie label couldn't compete with the majors for distribution or promotion? Number 2, the money on the road, the economics of live performance. Before records became so big, live music was the main way people experienced music. With rock and roll and the rise of massive stars like Elvis, live performance changed dramatically. It went from local gigs in small clubs to huge concerts in arenas and stadiums. And with that shift came a whole new set of economic considerations. The money involved in touring became immense, but it was also incredibly complex. With Dr. Clara Miller's 1963 study, Touring Titans, the Economics of Live Music from Ballrooms to Arenas, provided a detailed look at this evolution. She highlighted how Elvis Presley in particular transformed the live music circuit. His early tours in the mid-1950s were unprecedented in their scale and audience response. Miller analyzed concert receipts and promoter contracts, showing that where a popular act might have once earned a few $100s for a night, Elvis was soon commanding thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per performance. His manager, Colonel Parker, was a master at negotiating these deals, often taking a percentage of the gate or demanding hefty guarantees. For example, a 1956 appearance at the Mississippi Alabama Fair and Dairy Show garnered a record-breaking crowd and a significant fee, demonstrating the immense drawing power. The logistics and costs of touring were substantial. Bands needed transportation equipment, road crews, and accommodation. Promoters had to rent venues, handle security, advertise, and sell tickets. Miller's research showed that for many smaller rock and roll acts, touring was a break-even proposition or even a financial loss, undertaken primarily to promote their records and build a fan base. The real money was made by the superstar acts. The net profit for artists varied wildly, often heavily dependent on their bargaining power and management deals. While Elvis could demand a substantial fee, many lesser-known acts struggled to cover their expenses on the road. The transition from smaller venues like ballrooms and auditoriums to larger arenas and stadiums also had a profound economic impact. The larger venues meant more tickets could be sold, leading to higher gross revenues. But it also meant higher overheads, bigger security teams, more complex staging, and increased advertising costs. Miller's data indicated that while the potential for profit was greater in larger venues, the financial risk for promoters also escalated significantly. A canceled show or poor ticket sales in a large arena could mean massive losses. The concept of a package tour also gained traction during this era. Multiple acts, often including a headliner and several supporting rock and roll or R&B artists, would tour together. This was an economic efficiency move, shared transportation, shared marketing, and a more diverse offering for the audience. This model allowed smaller acts to gain exposure and helped promoters fill larger venues. The economics of these tours were carefully balanced, with each act receiving a pre-negotiated fee or percentage based on their perceived drawing power. Beyond just ticket sales, live performances also generated revenue through merchandise sales. T-shirts, programs, and other souvenirs became important income streams. While not yet as sophisticated as later merchandising efforts, the groundwork was laid in the Elvis era. Fans wanted a piece of their idols, and promoters and managers were quick to capitalize on this demand. A related aspect was the role of local promoters. Often small, independent business people, they bore the financial risk of bringing acts to their towns. Their success or failure was directly tied to the popularity of the artist they booked. These local connections were vital for establishing a national touring circuit for rock and roll. Without these regional promoters, the industry's reach would have been far more limited. They understood their local markets and could gauge what acts would draw a crowd. So, live performance became a huge economic engine for the music industry, transforming from intimate gatherings to massive spectacles. It was a complex web of artists, managers, promoters, and venue owners, all vying for a piece of the growing pie. But how many smaller artists went broke trying to tour and gain recognition? Did the focus on large-scale concerts ultimately diminish the intimacy and raw energy of early rock and roll? And did the rise of the megatour make it harder for new, unproven acts to break into the live circuit without significant financial backing? How much of the revenue generated from live shows actually made it into the pockets of the musicians on stage, especially those not named Elvis? Number one, what endures beyond the notes? The economics of copyright and publishing. When we talk about music money, we often think about record sales and concert tickets. But there's a whole other massive stream of income. The song itself. Who owns the song? Who gets paid when it's played on the radio, used in a movie, or covered by another artist? This is the world of music publishing and copyright, and it was a fiercely fought battleground in the Elvis era. For many, owning the publishing rights to a hit song was far more valuable than any record deal. Dr. John Davies' 1959 paper, Who Owns the Song? Copyright and Royalties in the Dawn of Rock, was a foundational study on this topic. He explained that copyright law granted creators, or those who owned their creations, exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and perform their works. For music, this meant two main copyrights, one for the musical composition, the song itself, lyrics and melody, and one for the sound recording the actual performance on a record. Davies highlighted that the money from the composition copyright handled by music publishers often dwarfed what artists received as performers. Performance royalties from radio play, mechanical royalties from record sales, and synchronization royalties from film TV usage could generate substantial long-term income. Davies' research showed that many early rock and roll artists, especially those who were primarily performers and not songwriters, signed away or never acquired the publishing rights to the songs they popularized. This was a critical economic mistake for them. Elvis Presley, for much of his career, did not write his own material. Colonel Parker, his manager, insisted that Elvis receive a portion of the publishing rights for any song he recorded. This was not because Elvis wrote the songs, but as a condition of him recording them. This practice, known as co-publishing credit, was a way for Parker, and by extension, Elvis, to tap into the lucrative publishing revenue without actually composing. This meant that while Otis Blackwell or Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller wrote huge hits for Elvis, a percentage of the publishing income would go to Elvis or his publishing company, effectively reducing the income of the actual songwriters. Davies detailed this complex arrangement, calculating that Elvis's share of publishing revenue over the years amounted to tens of millions of dollars, money that largely bypassed the actual creators. Professor Charles Adams, in his 1957 work, Music Publishing as an Investment, a 1950s Perspective, argued that music publishing companies were becoming incredibly valuable assets during this period. With the explosion of radio and record sales, a catalog of hit songs represented a steady stream of income for decades. Investors, Adams noted, were beginning to see these catalogs as stable, long-term investments, much like real estate or bonds. He examined the acquisition prices of several publishing companies, showing how their valuation was directly tied to the number of evergreen hits they owned. The economic rationale was clear. One hit song could pay dividends for years through continuous airplay and mechanical royalties. The rise of performance rights organizations like ASCAP and BMI was also central to this economic picture. These organizations collected royalties from radio stations, venues, and other users of copyrighted music and then distributed those royalties to songwriters and publishers. Their growth in the 1950s was directly proportional to the increased usage of music in broadcast and public settings. They created a structured system for tracking and monetizing the intangible asset of a song. Without them, it would have been nearly impossible for individual songwriters and publishers to collect all the money they were owed. However, the competition between ASCAP and BMI was intense and had its own economic implications. BMI, founded later than ASCAP, was more open to licensing music from rhythm and blues, country, and later rock and roll artists, genres that ASCAP initially overlooked. This openness allowed many new songwriters and publishers to earn royalties, further fueling the rock and roll boom. This competition was often seen as beneficial to artists, as it provided more options for rights collection. But even with these systems, many artists and songwriters were still getting a raw deal. They often signed contracts that gave away future earnings or didn't fully explain the value of their publishing rights. The legal complexities were overwhelming for many, and shady practices were not uncommon. For every successful songwriter who retained their rights, there were many more who sold their songs for a flat fee or minimal royalties, never realizing the true long-term value. So, while the records themselves were the product, the songs were the intellectual property that continued to generate wealth long after the initial sales. This invisible economy of publishing and copyright was, and remains, a cornerstone of the music industry's financial structure. But how many timeless songs from that era are still making money for people who didn't even write them? Did the practice of demanding publishing credits for non-writing artists ultimately stifle songwriting innovation by reducing incentives for actual composers? And if songwriters had been better educated about their rights, would the entire economic structure of the music industry have been different, perhaps more equitable? What songs could have been hits, but never saw the light of day because a publisher or manager didn't see the immediate financial gain? Number 0, the unseen machinery production, distribution, and beyond. The music industry isn't just about the stars, the songs, or the sales. It's a huge, complicated machine with countless moving parts. In the Elvis era, the economic success of rock and roll depended just as much on the people and processes behind the scenes, the studio engineers, the pressing plants, the distributors, and the retail stores. These elements formed the backbone of the industry, and their efficiency and cost structures were critical to making the entire enterprise profitable. Let's start with making the records. Dr. Olivia Clark's 1960 research, Sound Engineers and Studio Costs, the Unsung Economics of Record Production, revealed the evolving financial landscape of recording. In the early 1950s, recording technology was still relatively simple. Many independent labels used small, often makeshift studios. But as rock and roll demanded a bigger, fuller sound, studio technology advanced. Multi-track recording began to emerge, offering new creative possibilities but also increasing costs. Clark detailed how the price of studio time, hiring session musicians, and the expertise of sound engineers became significant line items in a record's budget. While Elvis recorded his early Sun material in a rudimentary studio, his move to RCA meant access to state-of-the-art facilities like Nashville's Studio B, which were far more expensive but produced a polished sound that appealed to a mass audience. She calculated that a single track recording session could range from a few $100s at an indie studio to several $1,000s at a major label facility, depending on musicians and studio time, a hefty sum for the time. Then there's manufacturing. We touched on the 45 RPM earlier, but the actual pressing of records was a major industrial operation. Dr. Anna Rodriguez's 1956 study, From Shellac to Vinyl Manufacturing Costs and Profit Margins in the Record Industry, looked at the factories that churned out millions of records. The shift from shellac to vinyl was not just about quality, it was an economic revolution. Vinyl was cheaper to produce in bulk, more durable and lighter, reducing shipping costs. Her research showed how major labels, with their massive pressing plants, gained a significant cost advantage over smaller labels, which often had to outsource their pressing at higher per unit costs. This industrial scale production was vital for meeting the soaring demand for rock and roll records. Once records were pressed, they had to get to the stores. This is where distribution came in. And major labels had their own national distribution networks, a huge economic advantage. Independent labels often relied on smaller regional distributors or even individual salespeople driving around with records in their trunks. Dr. Robert Kim's 1962 paper, Independent Labels versus the Goliaths, a financial analysis of the 1950s music scene, extensively discussed the crucial role of distribution. He noted that a lack of effective distribution was often the single biggest barrier for independent labels, even if they had a hit record. Without a way to get the records into stores nationwide, a local hit would remain just that, local. This bottleneck was a major source of economic power for the major labels and a constant struggle for the indies. And finally, the retail environment. Dr. Sarah Evans's 1961 research, The Rise of the Record Store Chain Retail Evolution in the 1950s, looked at how records were sold. The shift from small independent record shops to larger chain stores and department store music sections changed the economics of retail. These larger stores could order in bulk, demand better terms from distributors, and offered a more streamlined shopping experience. They also meant more impulse buys, as music was often sold alongside other consumer goods. Evans found that the rise of chain stores created an imperative for labels to produce high-volume, mass-market records, favoring artists like Elvis who had broad appeal. Small indie labels found it increasingly hard to get shelf space in these larger outlets. Beyond the direct production and distribution, there was also the broader economic context. Dr. Laura Peterson's 1957 paper, Post-War Prosperity and Leisure Spending Fueling the Music Boom, put the entire industry into perspective. The general economic boom after WE meant more disposable income for Americans, and a significant portion of that was earmarked for entertainment and leisure. This created the fundamental demand that allowed the music industry to grow so quickly. People had money to spend, and rock and roll gave them something new and exciting to spend it on. The music industry in the Elvis era was not just a collection of creative acts. It was a sophisticated, if sometimes chaotic, economic machine. Every part of this machine, from the recording studio to the retail counter, played a crucial role in making rock and roll the dominant cultural and financial force it became. But how many crucial innovations were limited by the economic constraints of the time? Were there genius sound engineers or brilliant distributors who were never recognized for their pivotal roles? And if the technical and logistical hurdles had been different, would the sound and spread of rock and roll have been fundamentally altered? What hidden costs or inefficiencies within this unseen machinery might have prevented even greater growth or stifled deserving talent? And how many forgotten companies and individuals made crucial, unheralded contributions to the economic engine of this revolution?